Well, folks, it's finally time. After much anticipation on my part, we may finally have an alternative to Games Workshop Contrast paints. I'm going to find out if they're going to do the job with the starter set that I just picked up from my local store. So the first thing that I really noticed as soon as I opened up the pots is they're obviously a different shape to the contrast paint pots, and it's not a big deal. These are the contrast paint pots offer a lot of convenience in terms of you just pop the lid, put your brush straight in there and paint it straight on the model. Those contrast paints really don't need any kind of thinning, and so it's kind of like a lot of people use the GW shades. They just, put that brush straight in the pot and it works great. But the second thing that I noticed about the ArmyPainter paints is that they are actually quite a bit thicker than contrast paints, and as I was using them I really did feel like I needed to thin them down, especially to see that contrast effect come to life, to get that differentiation between the mid-tone and the shadows. It was really helped by introducing a little bit of water to the paint. So ultimately I ended up using them just like regular paints on a wet palette, because if I'm going to be introducing water anyway, I might as well have them on my wet palette. It was a very different experience. They act almost more like gel paints, like the scale color line of paints, which is a little weird at first. They are very, very highly pigmented, super high coverage, super vibrant colors, which is great. You do notice that they are not as good at doing the contrast effect as the GW contrast paints, but I think a lot of that is offset by thinning them a little bit so that there's a little bit more flow to the paints. Another thing I noticed in using them, and I didn't really kind of do an A/B test of this one, I didn't test it rigorously, but it feels like they dry a little bit quicker than contrast paints, which is actually a little bit of a frustration for me, because painting large areas, it was actually difficult to get coverage of the whole area before it started drying, and the problem with that is that you then get ripping of the paint and tide marks and things like that where you've painted in different sections. But it wasn't too bad, it was generally doable. I painted, as you can see, the Elthane Soul Raiders from Warhammer Underworlds. I did a couple of them, Furion and Doingclaw, with exclusively SpeedPaint paints. And then I did Tamael and the Spine Fin exclusively contrast paints, and then I mixed the two up a little bit on Elthane himself. It was a great experiment. I had a lot of fun doing it. You definitely notice just how vibrant the colors are from the SpeedPaint line. It's really quite impressive. I also tried a few other things. I tried mixing SpeedPaint's different colors. I used that for the armor, and I actually also introduced a little bit of contrast medium into the armor, which, curiously enough, considering contrast paints are pretty matte or satin, and speed paints on their own are pretty satin, mixing this contrast medium into the speed paint seemed to give quite a high gloss finish. Not bad per se, but definitely something to be mindful of. I actually, the more I used them, the more I liked the fact they came in dropper bottles. As soon as I decided to put them on my wet palette, it all came together for me. It didn't impact their performance, it made it easier to thin them, It encouraged me to mix the paints, which is something that I always feel like I should try with contrast paints, but given that they're in those pots, it just ends up feeling like such a hassle to do it. Whereas with speed paints, I just, have them on the wet palette ready to go. I can mix them. I mixed the grey and the blue for the armor, for instance. I mixed the yellow and the bone to get the sand effect on Furion and Doomclaw. It's super easy. It works just like any other paint, and it's kind of refreshing. Now, I did not leave them on the wet palette overnight or for an extended period of time. I'm not sure how that would work, how the water would interact with the drying times. So that may not be the best of solutions, but for a single paint session, putting it on a wet palette, thinning it with a little bit of extra water was ideal for these paints. All in all, I think they're a pretty close match to the contrast paints. They have their own foibles and their own quirks. I do want to try more of them. I will be getting probably the full line at some point. My paint style relies very heavily on contrast over zenithal, and these paints perform that just as well as the GW contrast paints, really. The one thing to note with these paints is there have been a lot of reports of the paint rehydrating as you put extra paint over the top. So what this means is that the paint kind of reverts to a solution and lifts off the figure as you paint over it. If you work the brush over an area that's been painted, and you can test this out even just with some water, I definitely noticed that the paint was lifting. It got better if I dried it for a little while, or when I applied a hairdryer to dry it, kind of really extract all of the moisture from it. I'm still able to do kind of edge highlighting and dry brushing over the top of it without any issue. But if I was really painting over the area, I think that would probably end up being a problem. If I'm trying to introduce blends or glaze over the top of the speed paint, that's definitely not going to work. Fortunately for me, that's not how I tend to paint very much anyway, and I'd be happy to use contrast paints knowing that ahead of time. But if you went into this without being aware of that, you could end up ruining a paint job just by accidentally tearing the paint. I did test it out, particularly on Doomclaw with the top of the shell. The green effect there is actually not speed paint. It is a Liquitex ink, because I heard about this effect and I wanted to test it. And sure enough, I was lifting that paint underneath as I was blending that green ink into the surface of the shell. So that is something to be mindful of. Is it a showstopper? Does it ruin your models? Honestly, probably not. If you're the kind of person that's gonna just paint this one layer on and call it done, go for it. It's gonna give you a good result. Thin it with some water, but you're gonna have a great time. If you want to put one or two edge highlights or something, or dry brush over the top of it, you're still fine. If you are, like I sometimes do, using these as a base coat for a much higher end finish, if you're maybe doing a display piece or something like that, and you want this to map your color, but then you're going to glaze in highlights, maybe reinforce shadows, introduce other colors, at that point I would suggest maybe sticking with contrast paints, which have got a much more robust finish and aren't going to lift off in the same way. If you are concerned about the speed paints rehydrating, you can just put a layer of varnish over the speed paint once it's dried, and then paint over the top of that, and that will prevent the paint from rehydrating. But that's a relatively minor quibble for a paint that is something like half the cost of Games Workshop Contrast. I did find the selection in the starter set a little bit limited. It has all of the primaries, it has a grey, although not a black. It does not have a white, but I've never liked the white contrast paint. In any case, it doesn't work for my style of painting particularly well, because I already have that zenithal in place. If I'm doing white, I just leave the zenithal there and bring up the highlights with some concentrated applied white. But other than that, it was fine. For me, what I realized in painting these is how dependent I am on the browns that Games Workshop offers. You know, there's 6 or so various shades of brown: Skeleton Horde, Agros Dunes, Snakebite Leather, Cygor Brown, Wildwood, Gore-Grunter Fur, and that's not even including all of the flesh tones. This paint set had 1 flesh tone. It has 1 equivalent of Skeleton Horde, Pallid Bone, and it has a single brown, which I think is called Hardened Leather, which is a very, very close proxy to Snakebite Leather. So effectively you come with Skeleton Horde, Guilliman Flesh, and Snakebite Leather. And that's fine, but for me, I would have liked a richer, deeper brown, an equivalent of Gore-Grunter Fur as well, because I use those colours so often that having equivalents for them would be nice. I'm sure that there's one in the full lineup. I haven't checked yet, and I'm sure I'm going to be picking the full lineup anyway. For a starter set, this is a great offering. One thing I did want to mention is how impressed I was with the quality of the brush that they included in the starter set. I am so used to starter set brushes being complete crap that I would normally just throw them out without even looking at them. The Games Workshop starter brush is the worst thing ever made. This is actually one of their regular brushes. It's their monster brush, the one that I got in my set. I don't know if it always is, or if it's maybe sometimes a regiment brush or something like that. But the fact that it's one of their regular plain brushes that costs like $8 or something if you buy it on its own was a really nice, refreshing touch. I actually painted all of these models using just this brush, just really to put it through its paces, and it's definitely a nice add to the starter set. So I was honestly pretty impressed with that. Not my style of brush, but a very good brush nonetheless. One other thing to say about the paint and applying the paint that is a nice change from Games Workshop contrast paints, and I think something a lot of other reviewers have mentioned as well. This doesn't retain brush marks to the same extent contrast paint does. When you first start using contrast paints, especially if you're working on broader, flatter surfaces, there's frequently a bit of a frustration with the degree to which the brush leaves streaks, lines in the paint that it's being applied to. That really was not the case with SpeedPaint at all. I painted the cloak on Althane entirely with contrast paint, and honestly not even particularly carefully, and completely brush stroke free. That was a really pleasant surprise, and possibly one of the best selling points for it if you're painting Space Marines, or maybe some of the classic orcs with the big round spherical volumes and fairly small amount of texture on those fleshy areas. This may actually be a really good option for you. Probably still wouldn't brush paint a tank with them. The drying time again is going to come into that, but for things like shoulder pads and knee pads and the surfaces that you get on Stormcast Eternal or on Space Marines, they're going to work really well for you, I suspect. So all in all, I do like these paints a lot. I am going to continue experimenting more with them, seeing how far they go, and I will probably do a year in review, just as I did on my blog for contrast paints. You can find that at ragados.com. As always, folks, thank you for watching. Please consider liking, subscribing, hitting the bell to get notifications when I post new content. Also consider checking out the affiliates in the description below. And for now, later days.